Is Canada a better place to live in or the US? Many people have really strong opinions on this, even though they really haven't lived in both countries. In this video, based on first-hand experience, we'll compare the quality of life in these two countries from different angles. So let's dive right into it. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Ehsan. I got a PhD in electrical engineering at the University of Pennsylvania. I currently work as an optical engineer in a large company in the US, and before that, I was working in a similar role in a small company in Vancouver, British Columbia. Therefore, I have lived and worked in both the US and Canada. And hopefully, you can trust what I say in this video. I'll do my best to stay unbiased, even though I clearly prefer one country over the other. First, let's compare the two countries in terms of immigration. In general, Canada has a much faster, easier, and more straightforward immigration path compared to the US. The procedure and requirements for obtaining legal permanent residence, also known as a green card in the US, or a PR in Canada, are far more difficult in the US. In the US, the most common routes for obtaining a green card involve either convincing an employer to sponsor you. Trust me, this is more difficult than it sounds, since the process is so expensive and time-consuming for the employer, or pursuing a self-petitioning strategy through the National Interest Waiver Program, but this is also very expensive and it has challenging eligibility requirements. On the other hand, in Canada, getting a PR is basically a piece of cake, and most international students easily get their PR shortly after getting a master's degree in Canada. Obtaining citizenship is also much faster in Canada compared to the US. In Canada, you're eligible to apply for citizenship only 2 years after getting your PR, assuming you've been living in Canada for at least a year on a visa before getting the PR, whereas you have to wait 5 years in the US after you get your green card. Speaking of citizenship, both countries offer citizenship by birth, even if the parents are on temporary visas. This citizenship policy is unlike Europe, Australia, and basically anywhere other than the Americas. Both countries are overall very immigrant-friendly, especially around the major cities. And in both countries, you can rise to the very top regardless of where you come from if you work hard enough. Now, let's talk about how the US and Canada compare in terms of standard of living. Well, the short answer is that the US generally offers a much higher standard of living. Why? Well, first of all, the salaries for professionals in the US are generally much higher, roughly 2 times higher for the same job compared to Canada. And you can find way more excellent job opportunities in the US. At the same time, taxes are way lower in the US compared to Canada. You pay less sales tax and less income tax. There are even tax exemptions in the US that help you pay even less tax. For example, the interest you pay on your mortgage for your principal residence in the US is generally tax deductible, while this is not the case in Canada. Another example is that clothes are generally tax exempt in the US, but not in Canada. On top of that, the cost of living in the US is generally lower than Canada. Everything in Canada tends to be way more expensive. For example, gas and groceries are so much more expensive in Canada that you often see families in Canada drive to the US during the weekend just to fill up a tank of gas and buy some groceries. Even buying the same thing from Amazon in Canada is way more expensive than buying the same item in Amazon from the US. Even home internet and cell phone plans are many times more expensive in Canada compared to the US. And finally, housing costs, being the elephant in the room, are super high in Canada, whereas you can find plenty of very affordable, decent major metropolitan areas in the US. All right, how do the two countries compare in terms of university education? Well, the US obviously has way more universities, but also the world's highest ranking universities such as Stanford, MIT, and Harvard that don't really have any counterpart in Canada. In Canada, the tuitions are generally much lower compared to the US. So that's a big plus for Canada, especially for undergrad. On the other hand, the US tends to offer much more generous scholarships, especially for grad school. For example, the stipend a PhD student receives in the US is usually way more than Canada. Let's shift gears now. When it comes to healthcare, the main difference between the US and Canada is that Canada offers a universal public healthcare system where every Canadian is covered regardless of employment status. On the other hand, the US mostly relies on a private healthcare system, and health insurance is usually provided by the employer. So, which healthcare system is better? Well, in Canada, healthcare is basically free. It's not really free since the hardworking Canadians are paying an arm and a leg for it through taxes. If you look at it that way, it's really expensive. But anyways, since it's free, people tend to go to the doctor just for the fun of it. The result is super long wait times when you actually want to see a doctor, and you have to wait months before receiving any treatment. I personally sprained my finger in the last week I was in Canada, and I couldn't find a single urgent care center that would accept me. On the other hand, in the US, the wait times are much shorter, but the expenses for healthcare can be really high. If you're unlucky enough to lose your job due to medical conditions such as cancer, then you also lose your medical insurance and you'll be in big trouble. Finally, how do the two countries compare in terms of crime rates? Honestly, Canada wins this category. A typical large Canadian city like Vancouver is significantly safer than a typical large American city like Chicago. In fact, most large American cities have lots of neighborhoods you don't really want to step foot in, as they're like a war zone or a no-go zone. On the other hand, such rough neighborhoods are rare in large Canadian cities. With that said, the suburban areas around large American cities are comparatively much safer usually. In fact, I live in a suburb of Minneapolis-St. Paul mainly for this reason. Crimes such as bike theft or catalytic converter theft are unfortunately quite common in both countries. Gun violence is a much bigger problem in the US compared to Canada, but luckily neither myself or any friends and family members of mine have been a victim yet. There you have it. Now you have a deep understanding of how life is different in Canada versus the US, beyond, of course, just the winter weather. Which country is your favorite? I hope you found this video helpful. If you got any value from this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and leave a comment below. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.